Because of the following special program, Mr. Merlin will not be presented this evening.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
This portrait of Jean Grey, the Phoenix, is one of the ones I did for a series of single frame mock-up kind of covers for the Marvelocity book, where my concept was it would work like an accordion. When you open up the book, getting past the initial Captain America cover, you would fold it out and you get Iron Man and character after character after character, and it allowed me then to do multiple Marvel character portraits. Phoenix being one of the most primary Marvel concepts, because her storyline back in 1980, the invention of that character, that maturation of Jean Grey into the Phoenix, was one of the best storylines in the history of comics and stands out as one of the most important female superheroes.
Coming February 21st, it's Faye and the Moon, the latest graphic novel from Franco and the Saturn Sisters. Faye, mourning for her missing mother, sits night after night below the moon that her mother loved dearly. One night she discovers she can pluck the moon out of the star-filled sky. Back safe in her house, she holds it close, feeling comfort at last. Then Faye loses the moon and finds that taking it has awakened ancient monsters, rats, dragons, and more, who hunt for it for themselves. Will Faye be able to reclaim the moon, find her own inner strength, and save the world from eternal darkness? Faye and the Moon comes from the minds of Franco, whose works include Tiny Titans, Superman of Smallville, Archimaniacs, Itty Bitty Hellboy, and The Ghost and the Owl, and art from the Saturn Sisters, whose animated works include Sesame Studios' The New Neighbors, Hulu's The Awesomes by Seth Meyers, and PBS's Mira, Selkie from the Sea. Pre-order Faye and the Moon now. Available in bookstores and comic shops everywhere, February 21st. Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Really happy Russ Burlingame reached out to me to talk about today's subject. Russ and I used to work at Newsarama, and before that, of course, Russ was at Wizard and lots of other places, currently writing articles at comicbook.com. Correct, Russ?
Yep, that's the one.
Nice to see you, and congratulations, man. You've got this Kickstarter campaign going on for an oral history of DC's Legends of Tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great subject. Why this television series?
It's kind of funny. I came at it really sideways. My original plan was I had just written a book a couple of years ago about the 2001 Josie and the Pussycats movie. And it was the same thing. It was like an oral history. I talked to the cast and crew. And so I wanted to do more stuff that was like culty, and that I thought, nobody else is going to do it if I don't just do it. And so I started working on an oral history of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it was going to be like part 1, the comic, part 2, a brief look at the history of event comics and how comics developed on TV. And then part 3, the TV event. And a handful of things all just kind of happened at once. One of which, of course, is that George passed away. And so I did not want to be poking at people's wounds. And so as I'm starting to write this book, I said, okay, well, I got to focus on the TV side first, and I'll go back and do comics. And as I was talking to the folks for the TV side, I just kept getting sidetracked with Legends, because there's a lot of fun stories. There's a lot of fun people, and I enjoyed the heck out of the show. And so it kind of became that thing of, why don't I pause Crisis for the moment? I'm still going to write that book. But I'm like, it's once the show got canceled, it very much became like, okay, now is the time to do this, because I can talk to people once it's over, but before they forget everything, because they've been doing 5 other projects.
Sure.
So
that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And also, and maybe I'm wrong, but you're deep in the woods, so you can tell me if I'm right. Um, Obviously, Legends was kind of the afterthought show compared to Arrow and the Flash, and maybe some of the other CW shows. It reminds me of Deep Space Nine's. While Deep Space Nine was happening in Star Trek, that they literally the network was like, well, we got to go all about Next Generation, and then they create Voyager in after Deep Space Nine. Well, now we really got to focus on the new show. So Deep Space Nine was kind of left to its own. You know what I'm saying? To its own,
its own devices.
And devices. Thank you.
That's a really good.
Today.
I wouldn't have thought about that, but that's a really good corollary. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was an afterthought, because obviously I think what happened was that after the success of Arrow and Flash, they were like, "Ooh, the Avengers just happened. Let's do a team and we'll make $1 billion." But then when Legends' first season didn't deliver Flash level ratings, they were just kind of like, okay, so that's a thing that'll do over there. But Supergirl's shiny. She's new. We just brought her over from CBS. And so I think you're very right in the sense that, especially because the Arrowverse was expanding all of the time. And so it was like there was always something else that was more interesting to management than Legends. And then all of a sudden, management kind of looked up from their book, and they were like, oh, we have this show that's taken on its own entirely weird identity, and the critics love it, and it's got this small but incredibly rabid fan base.
I've only had the opportunity to talk to Mark Guggenheim a handful of times, but each time we get closer, and I really like and respect Mark a lot.
Yeah.
And prior to, I think it was the crisis that they really went balls out on.
Yeah.
We were both at Terrificon in Connecticut, and it's a long ride from the convention center to the airport. So, like an hour or so. And we're just talking, and he was so excited about all the stunt casting that they were going to do, but also just giving me just a nuts and bolts kind of feel for Legends of Tomorrow and the Arrowverse in general, all the CW shows. But it really was interesting, and I would imagine beyond Mark, who are the other creatives that you talk to, the writers?
Well, I've talked already to a handful, and I've got a bunch more that I'm talking to. But the writers and producers that I've spoken to already are Mark. I spoke with Phil Klemmer and Keto Shimizu, and Phil and Keto are basically the two people who ran the show. Because Mark and Phil co-created it, but Mark went straight from having Arrow to developing Green Lantern and stuff like that, and Troll Hunters. And so he was never the day-to-day showrunner on Legends, really. So I talked to Phil, I talked to Kato. I spoke with Kevin Mock, who's the producing director, who's basically in TV, directors operate differently than in movies. And the producing director is the guy who stays there all the time and tells the weekly incoming director, here's how we work. And then some of the producer writers like Morgan Faust and James Egan and Ray Udernaket, which I am positive I said his name wrong, but I'm talking to him, I think tomorrow. We have a mutual friend who just bumped us both and was like, hey, remember you were going to do a thing?
Are you getting the cast as well? Are you able to, who have you got from the cast?
As much as I can. I'm still reaching out with cast. I have new interviews of unseen material that I did for the book with Tala Ash, Adam Scheckman, who played Gary on the show, Jess McCallan, who was Ava. I've got Eric Gow, I know I'm talking to in the next little while, who is Mr. Parker and who's been one of the big, most vocal fans of the show. I know that I've got one or two other people who I'm going to feel really stupid for forgetting later. But I also, because of the nature of TV now, have a wealth of archival material that I'm able to dip into and be like, oh, this is what they were thinking at the time. So, for instance, when I was talking with Kevin Mock, who directed the episode Phone Home, he made a reference to how they always wanted to get into Ray having a brother, and it just never happened because time, all that kind of stuff. And so in this episode where Ray's a kid, they make sure to mention the brother because it was laying something for later. And that tickled the back of my brain a little bit. And I went back through my archives and I found that when I spoke with Brandon Routh on the set, like on the Wave Rider years and years ago, Brandon, talking about that episode, had said, "Oh, and this is really cool because we find out he had a brother, and I hope they do something interesting with that down." And so you can kind of do the juxtaposition of what we never got to and the comments of at the time that says, "Yep, they really were trying."
That's cool. And also, it seemed, how many seasons was it? 7?
7, yeah.
Yeah, the certainly in the last couple of seasons, they even seem to get more and more inventive. What I always liked about Legends, and this was always the case, they were the show that had the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody, and maybe because it was such a large cast and everything, and also a cast of all superheroes, that they almost had to be that way. And also just they were on the run all the time, being in the Wave Rider and everything. And I just thought it was fun. I thought it also got incredibly inventive in the last couple of seasons.
I think one of the things that made it really so exciting for like the hardcore fans and for critics is that like look at the Flash or Arrow, and I genuinely enjoy those shows. I'm not knocking them at all, but I'm going to make a point of comparison. Arrow did sometimes kind of go off the reservation and be like, here's a season where stuff's magic, and that's wild because I'm a dude with a bow and arrow. But for the most part, like every superhero show has the same basic setup and the same basic formula. It's like you don't have a season where Flash leaves Central City and there's no Star Labs and there's no supporting cast and there's no way to get home. But with Legends, they were like, but what if we did? What if we had this $2 million standing set and we just didn't use it for 10 episodes in the last season because we're stuck in 1925, you know? And I think that's the kind of thing that Legends did all the time, is they would constantly reinvent the wheel. So instead of just being, this is what we do, and here's the bad guy who's stopping us from doing it, it's like the bad guy kind of dictated what the season was. And so the whole show would change year after year.
I also think especially in today's television environment, where even network shows are cutting back to 13 good episodes, like The Good Place on NBC.
Yeah,
it's like I can only make a dozen or so episodes a year for this kind of quality, and thank God NBC's like, that's fine. We see how good this show is. We're gonna let you do it. And sadly, the CW was under that 20 plus episode season, and a lot of times that the Arrowverse formula of the big bad, they would have to, just to make the quota and give the show a little space, throw in these bottle shows and these one shots and stuff, and we're all like, no, we want to, you set up this big bad, that's all we give. At least that was my feeling. That's all we give a shit about.
It's kind of funny because with Legends, I think that the fact that it was not a mega hit, it kind of accidentally created a very different kind of show, because while Arrow and Flash were doing 22 episode seasons, and half of that was necessarily filler because you can't drag the big bad fight over 22 episodes. Legends was like, okay, well, maybe this year we'll get 11 and then 15 and then 10, And so it felt like, Legends had the streaming format of like, oh, we're going to have shorter seasons where every single one counts. And I don't think it was by design. I think it was purely because they were not as financially successful as the others. And so it was like, well, we'll bring you back, but only for 11.
Yeah, that kind of weirdness. But you're right. I think it played to their benefit. And the entire time, really during the prime years of the Arrowverse, I'm like, they should all be 11 to 15 episode seasons to make room for everybody. Because the other maddening thing was the 6-week breaks that the main shows would get. And you're like, okay, hey, all right, that's the end of December. We'll see you in March. And it's like, what? What?
Or even worse, we'll see you the first week of January for 2 episodes, and then we'll see you at the end of March.
Right.
And the other thing too, that I think when we talk about the the format of a lot of those shows and kind of why people felt like the seasons dragged, the thing that the comic book audience and that a certain percentage of the Arrowverse audience really was most passionate about every year was the crossovers.
Right.
It's like, we want to see our big event comic. And in order to do those right, they just exploded the schedules of all the shows. The production became hellish for like 3 weeks solid. And so you would have this bomb in the middle of the season, and it was a bomb of joy for everybody watching at home. But at the same time, it's like the episode before, the crossover episode after, usually have nothing to do with your big bad, because everything is about the crossover.
Right.
And so it's like, it's this weird thing where if you were more like Gotham and you had like chapters, you'd be more successful. But when you're looking at the Flash, that didn't really do that until last season. It was like every year they had to take a break in the middle of their story for something that wasn't their story. And again, Legends kind of, because they had such a huge cast, and I think there was a sense that there's no way to get all those people involved in the story, they were able to kind of slink away a little bit. And most of the crossovers, they would have Brandon Routh and Katie Lotz, because those two are very visible and very famous to the fans.
Sure.
But for the most part, the show itself didn't have to engage in a crossover if they didn't, quote unquote, want to.
I agree, man. And man, Katie Lotz, you got to hand it to her.
Oh yeah.
From starting off of being, a secondary character on Arrow, and all of us just loving her so much. And the creatives having the faith in her that she can carry a show. And I think she really was amazing.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like when they first started Legends, and again, this is not a thing anybody said to me, but this is my interpretation. I think when they first started Legends, they didn't really trust that Katie could carry a show. And so you had Brandon there as a co-lead. Like, if you look at every single poster for every single season up until season 5, it was always Katie and Brandon and then everybody else. And Dominic Purcell was pretty famous in and of his own right, but he's not exactly a guy who's going to do a lot of press for you.
Is that the case? Okay.
He's don't get me wrong. He loves Legends. He's very proud of the show. He plays ball, but like, he also just says whatever's on his mind. We had this one great conversation on set one year where he basically, I genuinely couldn't tell if he really didn't know the minutia of the Arrowverse because he didn't watch the other shows and didn't care, or if he was doing it because he didn't want to answer our questions. But either way, we had this like 12-minute conversation with him. And of those 12 minutes, I have a 7-minute private YouTube video that are all the bits the publicist said we can never let anyone see. And mostly it's just really dumb, hilarious stuff. Like at that time, it was right before Crisis on Earth X. Everybody was asking him about that. And somebody asked him like, hey, what's it like with Constantine? What's your dynamic with him? He's about to join the show. And Mick's like, Dominic is like, Constantine. And from the back of the room, I just go, trench coat. And he points at me, goes, oh, trench coat. And he answers the question. And I'm like, I can't tell if that's Dominic or if that's Mick Rory.
That's so fantastic. Russ, I don't know about you. And not only did I deal with press junkets in the nerd culture, but also I did it in sports. Yeah. And I don't know, man. I think around, I started Word Balloon in 2005. You started way before I did. And around 2010, I just got sick of it because you only get a couple minutes. And from Word Balloon, my God, I like long form.
Yeah.
And Roy Thomas, the first couple of times I tried to get him on Word Balloon, so I can give you 10 minutes. I'm like, I can't use 10 minutes, Roy. I go, you're Roy Thomas, man. Yeah. So thank God I got him for a couple longer conversations and stuff. And that's like, all right, I've had my piece with Roy. But yeah, man, it's God, the Watchmen film press junket that they did at WonderCon. I don't know if you were there.
I wasn't at WonderCon, but I did. Okay. I did an event for that in New York. And when I was at Newsarama, and it was the same. It was like, I remember I had gone as a fan to see them at the Apple Store, and it was Patrick Night Owl.
Oh yeah, Patrick Wilson. Yeah.
And the comedian Jeffrey Dean Morgan.
Jeffrey
And
Dean Morgan.
when I went to this actual press event with real microphones and things a few days later, it was like, these are the exact same quotes word for word, because everything at a junket has to be so carefully controlled, because you never want to go off the reservation and say the thing that everybody talks about, you know?
Agreed. Pardon me, everybody. My coffee's going down the wrong pipe. Yeah, and also, okay, you got 2 minutes with Jeffrey D. Morgan. Go. And it's like, all right. And thankfully, I was able to prepare, and I'm sure in your times too, like, all right, I've got my interesting question that hopefully this is coming from left field and they're not expecting it. Rorschach, Jackie Earle Haley. I had just seen Little Children. And he was so amazing in that. And I'm like, call me nuts, but I kind of see a connection to that psycho and this psycho. And his face dropped like, oh, this is a real question. And it was great. It was just our eyes where it's like, oh, you're asking me something real. And I'm like, yeah, man, I'm not going to ask you the bullshit questions, because I only got 2 minutes with you. So here it is. And it was so great. And luckily you get moments like that. But like you said, the PR people are watching you like hawks. Yeah. God forbid they say anything natural and like, well, you can't use that. And it's like, all right. And honestly, I am so sick of and the oxymoron of public relations people. Yeah. Because they're there to keep you away. They're not there to help you at all. And I am really sick of it. And I say that perfectly. And I'm like, what I prefer is the opportunity to talk to the right marketing people that understand. And it's like, no. I really want to talk to, well, luckily I deal directly with Dave Gibbons. Yeah. There are no PR people. Dave, I want to talk to you for an hour. Sure, John, no problem. And we have an amazing conversation.
It's funny because one of the things that I have been doing, because I know that people don't expect a real long conversation when a reporter calls them. When I'm talking to people for the book, if it's an actor, typically it's like, I get what I get. Like, whatever you can give me, I will make the best of it, but I want as much time as I can. But when it's the producers and the writers, I'll tell them up front, I'm like, look, the way I did it with Josie and the Pussycats is that I talked to the writer directors for 90 minutes, the first talk. And then I started talking to cast and crew. And once I had a bunch of stories that I could then go back to the directors and say, hey, do you remember this? Because the Soska sisters, who were extras in this one scene, remember a deleted scene that's never resurfaced. And then you can get things from the directors that you never would have gotten before because you've spoken with everybody. So like that's what I've been doing with the EPs and with the writers is I've been kind of explaining to them, like, so the process that I want to go with here is that we'll talk for like an hour and a half and I'll get a bunch of stuff from you and I'll use that to draw things out of the actors. And then we can come back together again in 3 months and you can see what my book looks like.
Have you, and again, I know that a lot of these interviews with the cast are in process. Mm-hmm. As I'm sure you know well by now, and certainly like you said, you have these longer talks with the producers, the writers, the creatives behind the camera, because especially the writer-producers, they're the keepers of character and story.
Oh, yeah.
If you really want to know what's going through Mick's mind and stuff, you talk to the writers. I mean, and again, no disrespect to Dominic or anything, but
right, absolutely.
But yeah, so but then also you have to be fair because once they do live with the character for several years, they do have input and they do have thoughts about what they're doing. So are you finding that you are finding some interesting insight from the stars?
Yeah, for sure. It's this didn't come from a star, but it's something that when I talk to her, I want to talk to her about. A great example of exactly what you're talking about is in one of the season 5 episodes when they finally got rid of Damien Dark for what was ostensibly the last time, where he sacrificed himself for his daughter again. I talked to them about the fact that this show was a show that loved to redeem its villains. And that it didn't feel like there was never a sense that at the end of every season we have to put an arrow through his eye. There are people like Astra Logue was a big bad for half of a season and then a legend for 3 years, And so I kind of talked about the fact that like Damien Dark is an absolute monster. in the context of the Arrowverse. He killed Laurel. He killed innumerable other like not main character people, and yet he still gets kind of a nice little ribbon on his send-off. And the guy who wrote that episode says, I'll tell you a good story about that speaks to our creative process. I said, I wrote that episode, I wrote that ending for him, and in my script, he put his hand out, and Sarah shook his hand before he was sent to hell. And Katie Lotz called me up and says, there's no way she would ever shake his hand. And so in the episode, it's played for a laugh, but like the idea that he sticks his hand out and she just looks at him like, don't make me kill you a second earlier. Like that was Katie's idea. She's just like, I get that that's where he is mentally. He thinks that he's fixed everything and he deserves a handshake, but there's just absolutely no way.
I love it. That's awesome, man. Here, Kenneth is saying hello to us both. If this book comes out, that would be awesome. Love Legends of Tomorrow, one of my favorite DC TV shows. Great cast, crew, and it was off the wall, bonkers fun. Absolutely, man.
Yeah. The great thing is I've done so much work on this, and also I'm so familiar with the process from doing both the Josie book and a collection of some of my old interviews that year, that it's gonna come out. Like, unless I, have a heart attack tomorrow or something. It's funny. I put a pretty low goal on this crowdfunding, and part of that was I am 100% sure that I'm going to finish and self-publish this book. And so, at Kickstarter, it's all or nothing. And so I'm like, I don't know exactly what the demand is. I'll make a fairly low goal, and then I'll just keep going once it's passed. I have my own little numbers in my head where I'm like, oh, if we get to this point, then I'll do an audiobook. If we get to this point, then I'll do X. But when you say if it comes out, it's definitely going to come out. The current release date I've got in my head is Groundhog Day 2024. Because Groundhog Day is a thing in the world of Legends of Tomorrow. Actually, I've got a red flannel on, so that's that episode. This was not by design, although I did put my Amelia Cole shirt on when I was doing a comic book show.
Nice.
But I am 100% certain that the book will come out. It might not come out on Groundhog Day if I'm not happy with it yet, because that's the beauty of self-publishing. But it'll be out in the early part of next year for sure. If it gives you a sense for how much I just want things to exist, and so I'll sink money into them and make sure they break even later. When I crowdfunded the Josie book, once we got over the initial hump, I was like, okay, if we get whatever the number was, an extra $500 or something, I'll put together a PDF of all of my old Gold Exchange interviews, which Gold Exchange started at Comic Related, went to Newsarama, then came to Comic Book. And it was me doing interviews. It was director's commentary style interviews with the folks who were doing volume 2 of Booster Gold. So most of the interviews were with Jurgens. There were a bunch of them with Mark DeMatteis. You had Remender in there. You had Jeff Johns in there. And I put together the PDF, gave it away to the people who backed the Josie book, immediately had some Booster Gold people be like, can we get a paper copy? And so I spent the next 18 months creating this monster of a paper copy where I reformatted all of the old interviews. I spent so much more time on it than I ever thought that I would. But now I have a 400-page Booster Gold book sitting on my shelf. And when it was announced he was coming to Legends, a friend of mine actually reached out, who Kevin Allen, who's like a big fan of Booster and who does a lot of fan fiction writing. He reached out to me. He's like, hey, what if I did like a Reader's Digest condensed version of the Gold Exchange that was meant for Legends fans? Like, here's everything you need to know about Booster in 120 pages or whatever. And I was like, beautiful, go for it. And because I self-published and I own the thing, he could just do that. And so there's another book out with my name on it that's just like, okay, before the Booster Gold TV show comes out, you want to know who that dude is? Here's a $7.99 book that's like 100 and something pages.
That's great, man. No, exactly. You got the Josie book, you got the Gold Exchange, all your articles at everywhere you've been, as you said.
Yeah.
No, I mean Russ is. You don't have to worry, Ken. I believe Russ when he says this book is.
And I don't think he was being disrespectful at all with that. I was just like, oh no, just so it's said. Because
I'm hip. And for the audio audience, I've got the URL in both the YouTube chat, and I've got it on screen as well for the Kickstarter. And man, the Kickstarter just started just over a day ago, right, man?
Yeah, yesterday at 10 a.m.
There you go. And I mean, already, you're over $4,500 as of
Yeah.
this recording. That's great. Like you said, you kept the goal low.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really hope that you
Yeah,
get a fair market amount as far as backing for this, because yeah, I know that it's not easy writing a book.
There's still a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the fans of the show. There's a really active like Save Our Show campaign that's still ongoing and still tweeting every day, and Legends trends all the time. And so one of the things that I promised those folks, I'm like, look, if this movie or if this book makes more than the Josie book did in its first 30 days, I will personally send a signed copy and a little Bebo doll to James Gunn. So
that sounds great. What do you think of the slate of Gunn's projects coming up?
I'm really enthusiastic about it. It's funny because a lot of people were as soon as it was rumored that Gunn was going to have any kind of power, I remember there being a lot of negative chatter about like somebody like Gunn having his hands on Superman. And one of the things that I said at the time, and I stick by it, is his characters have a real core of earnestness underneath all of the show that they put on.
Sure.
And, you see that on display in Guardians 2, like it's half the movie. And so I really do think that I think he's a smart enough guy to know when he can and cannot put on those extra airs. And I think that really he's a much better fit for a character like Superman than he appears at first glance.
Yeah.
And so I'm like I said, I'm optimistic about it. I don't think there's anything on there that I'm not at least interested to see how it comes out. There's some stuff I'm legitimately very, very excited for. And obviously like Booster Gold, Booster's my guy. When I started at Wizard and when I was 19 and doing my internship, the very first day, they were like, okay, because we didn't have company emails or anything. So they gave you a list of people and they're like, call these guys, say, hey, I'm Russ, I'm at Wizard now. So that way, if anything happens and we need a quick comment, they don't waste time calling to see if you're for real. And I was like, okay, fair. And one of those names was Dan Jurgens. And they said, oh, and while you're talking to Dan, he's got this Legion Titans thing going on. Get a couple of quotes. And Dan and I talked for about an hour and a half. And Dan does not remember any of this, and I doubt Joe Yanarella remembers any of it, but it's the clearest experience in my like 19 to 21 years. I was at my desk at the end of that first day, and Joe Yanarella, who was the managing editor of Wizard at the time, came and said, hey, can I see you for a minute? And calls me into his office, and immediately I'm like, this is because I spent an hour and a half on the phone and wasted all of Dan Jurgens' time. And he brings me in and he goes, I don't know what you said to Dan Jurgens. He loves you. I want you to talk to him about Aquaman. And it was just excellent. Like, we've been friends ever since. And so it's like, anytime something is good for Booster, it's good for me as far as I'm concerned.
Dude, I so hear you. I feel the same friendliness towards Dan. And it always means a lot. Again, terrific on another one of these long limo rides from the airport to Mohegan Sun. And it was Dan, me, Dan's wife, and Alex Saviak. And he's like, oh, John, thank God. I got someone to talk to in the car. And I'm like, okay, Dan.
Yeah. Well, it's funny.
I go back to that when Booster Gold was brand new, man, in the comics. And it was such an exciting concept.
Yeah.
And it really, I mean, everyone knows, and I know you feel this way as well. It blows my mind that these guys and women that we really respect as creators and stuff are now friendly to us and everything.
Oh, that's amazing. It's funny. I named my first kid after Dan Jurgens. And now we've been friends at that point for over 10 years, but at the same time, I was like, that's kind of a level up. So I'm going to call Dan and make sure he's okay with that. And I called him up and I said, hey, this is a thing that I was going to do. And he said, oh, yeah, sure. Great. And we chatted and we hung up. And then like the next morning I woke up and I had this long email from him that was very kind. That was like, hey, I don't want you to think I was being standoffish. That was just a shocking question. And so like, it's one of those weird things where it's like, yeah, when I got married, it happened to be the weekend of New York Comic-Con. And so it was like, none of my work friends could be there because everybody who I wanted to invite, who wasn't immediate family, was like stuck in New York no matter what.
Understood. Absolutely, man. I refer to San Diego when I go to Comic-Con. It's really expensive summer camp because all of our out of town friends, hey, we're all together. This is great. We're all hanging out and stuff.
Yeah.
So, it's a good time. No, you're right. Well, and the other weird thing is I remember, and I don't remember what the specific circumstance was, but Brian Bendis has become a good friend of mine. Mm-hmm. And you want to keep that distance. You don't want to be Kathy Bates. You don't want to be like, hey man, I don't want to bother you. I know you got shit to do. You got family, all that and everything. And at one point I was talking to him about something and he's like, John, we're friends. And I'm like, yeah, I guess we are. That's true. Okay, cool. And then like, for Rose City one year, he's like, you got to come out. And when you do, you could stay at my place. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then Alyssa, his wife, is like, hey, we mean it. We like you. And I'm like, okay. So I did. And it was great. And it was hilarious. We had a great time. But, and also, I don't know how you feel about this because you get hung with the journalism moniker. And it's like, I always say it's journalism with a small J. And it's entertainment, and I'm not looking to screw up any publisher. I'm not, right. It's entertainment journalism, and I like it myself. Forgive the comparison because this man was an icon, but I'm like, I'm Johnny Carson. I'm not Bob Woodward.
Yeah,
that's how I look at what I do with Word Balloon and stuff. And I don't know because it's really nice to become friendly with these people we cover, and really, again. Unfortunately, there are companies and networks and things that are making decisions that these creatives have nothing to do with. And it's just like, hey, man, I'm hanging on to, have a job, that kind of thing.
It's funny. I talk about exactly this kind of problem. Legends was canceled in, I think, May of last year. And so they weren't going to have a Comic-Con panel for the first time in 7 years. And so I was like, wouldn't it be fun on Comic-Con weekend if I talked to some of these guys and just did a little thing at Comic Book,
comicbook.com. Yeah.
And so I reached out to a bunch of folks, and one of the people I reached out to was Phil Klemmer, and I was like, hey, what if we did a commentary track for the finale? And he's like, man, I would love to do that. Yeah. So I said, okay, I'll reach out to Warner Brothers, make sure nobody's going to sue me. And then we'll do it. And about 2 weeks later, when I had no response from the publicist, Phil goes to me, hey, I want to do this thing and we're friends and I don't work for them anymore. So let's just do it and worry about it later. And by the time we got it done, I couldn't use it at Comic Book anyway. I ended up actually, like, they didn't pay for it. I didn't get it transcribed. So now it's just a bonus on my Kickstarter. But
oh, great.
But it's this weird thing where it's exactly what you're talking about. It's like, we're friends. We know the value of having an in-depth conversation about one small piece of media. And to Warner Brothers, the fact that I could have released it the week before the Blu-ray came out was less important than the fact that they wanted to control the verbiage. And they finally got back to me in like September or something. And their answer was, you can do it as long as you don't call it a commentary track, because Warner Home Video gets very defensive about that phrasing. and I'm just like, you gotta be kidding me.
Dude, I so hear you. All right, this is going back to my music days. I was an adult contemporary music director, and all the record companies, we helped make the top 30, which was in the trade magazine, radio, and records, like Billboard's top 40. We had the top 30. So the record companies took us seriously. And the Cars left RCA, it was RCA back then. It wasn't Elektra. And I forget what label they went to, but they had an album on the charts. And the music rep is like, listen, we're not really interested in promoting the cars anymore because they're not with us. I'm like, but they've got an album and they got hits on the charts. Yeah, we don't care. And I'm like, okay, so that was my first taste of something
Yeah.
like that. But you're right, and it is the dumbest things that sadly the publisher or the network feels they need to get involved. And it's like,
that's a big part of why I'm doing these, like, I'm doing these books self-published and I'm doing them unofficial, because it's
absolutely.
like I don't get, like, I can get yelled at by a publicist who's not happy with me, and in fact I did over this. Not actually, to be fair, not this specifically. When I was doing it as Crisis before the Legends thing happened, I reached out to John Cryer, and John's people reached out to the CW, and they're like, hey, do you know anything about this? And so for context, I actually did alert a publicist at the CW before I started the book. I called up an old friend of mine, Suzanne Gomez, who'd been at Warner Brothers for years and years and years, and is actually still working for Greg Berlanti. And I said, hey, I'm going to do this book. I'll send you a copy of the Josie book so that you know what I'm doing. You know that I'm not a troublemaker. Like, I'm just giving you a heads up. I'm not asking for permission. It's going to happen because it's journalism, but like, I'm giving you a heads up. And she was like, awesome. I can't wait to see it. If you need help with any of the people who I'm friends with, let me know. I can put you in touch with Erica Durance. And I was like,
that's lovely.
And yeah, she's consummate professional. And I'm not saying the person who followed her at her job is not in any way. But when Suzanne left Warner Brothers to go to Berlanti, nobody told the next person that I was doing this book. And so I got this long email from the person who succeeded her, like, what's going on here? And the answer was just, ask Suzanne. Like, I told you guys this was happening up front. I wanted exactly this to not happen. But on the other hand, I'm not hurting anybody, because like, this is not like, you know, one of the reasons, honestly, that the Crisis became like, I was like, oh, is the Ruby Rose of it all. It's like, until that all shakes out and until her book comes out, I don't want to be an irresponsible journalist and ignore her story. But I also know, A, she probably won't talk to me. And B, if I'm writing about Crisis and about Batwoman, I should at least acknowledge it. And so then it kind of, it puts up this barrier of like, what do I do next? But yeah, so I got off on a tangent there. I apologize, but
no, not at all. I think you illustrated the good side and bad side of marketing. And I do want to say, for the record, because they may or may not be listening or watching, and it's the truth, the current people at DC and Marvel have been nothing but helpful to me. And I really appreciate that. There have been times when predecessors have not. And that was always a frustration. And my thought in the back of my head, and I don't know about you, Russ, is you are going to come and go from this job. I am still going to be here.
Yeah.
The relationships that I've made are still going to be there. So don't get in. I mean, and not in any mean
no, not at all.
But it's literally, don't get in my way, because I've already forged this bridge with this creative.
Yeah.
And that bridge isn't going to be destroyed just because you don't get your say so in this.
Yeah. I'll blind everybody involved with this, because it's happened the other day. Nowadays, because comic book has grown so much and everything, I do a lot of TV and film coverage. When I do, it's mostly indie film. I'm not like Pretty and Young, so I don't go to the red carpets. But I was dealing with this publicist on an indie film the other day, and she was like, can you send me the Zoom links? And she sent me this note at 5 p.m. on Monday or whatever. Now at 1 p.m. on Monday, I got a terrible case of food poisoning, and for like 30 hours I was completely gone. And so when I came back on Wednesday, I had a note from one of the publicists for the talent themselves saying, hey, I didn't see your name on the list. I think it's because you didn't send a Zoom link. Would you like me to set something up for you?
Oh.
And this is a publicist I've known for 15 years, and I've dealt with a bunch. And I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And I got a note less than an hour later from the woman who's the publicist for the movie itself, where she just bawled me out. And it's, how dare you go around me? And I'm like, first of all, I never had any intent of going around you. And if I had any inkling that that's how this would be perceived, I would have copied you on the stupid email. But secondly, this is a problem that could have been fixed by copying you on an email, which means it's not worth this level of stress.
I hear you, man. No, I hear you. Absolutely. By the way, regarding Josie, I don't know if you know, that is like one of Bendis's guilty pleasure movies.
Bendis is in the book, actually.
Oh, that's so great, Russ. I'm so glad to hear that.
Well, what happened was I talked to a bunch of fans while I was developing the book, and I found it wasn't a huge number, but it was at least 3 or 4 people who said they found the movie because of Bendis. And I was like, how'd that work? And so, you know, Brian and I are friendly, which is funny because at one point there was a big public blow up in which neither of us participated, but both of our names were in it. So people assume I don't like him, but like, no, I like him quite a bit and we're friendly. And so I emailed him and I said, hey, you want to talk to me about Josie and the Pussycats? And he was like, of course. And the night before he got on the phone with me, I think he told me he showed his daughter the movie for the first time, and she knows all those characters from Riverdale, and was like, "What are we watching? This is wild."
That's great, man. No, he would. I very early in our friendship and everything, he's like, "Have you watched that movie? It's amazing." And I'm like, "All right."
Yeah, I made sure as soon as I knew that he was a big fan of it, I would have mentioned it even if he couldn't be in the book. But as soon as he was willing to jump on, I was like, okay, let's do it Monday.
Outstanding. That's fantastic. What else can I ask you about? Like, what are you covering right now for comicbook.com?
I'm on the news desk most of the time now. I don't have outside of I cover Superman and Lois and a lot of certain indie film studios. I do a lot with like Saban, and I do, certain publicists. A lot of my day is just kind of catching whatever is going towards the goal, which is funny because as you get older and as you have more experience, you should theoretically be like filing it down and getting a beat finalized. But what happened was that I went from working primetime when I'm covering exclusively TV to now I work 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. so that I can hang out with my kids more. And all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I'll just do whatever. I've been here for a long time. I got job security. I'm happy. And so like, I'm not super territorial about like, oh, I'm going to be covering X, Y, Z. I did tell them, I'm like, I'm going to keep Superman and Lois because I really love the show. I really enjoy the people's company. And, but other than that, it's really I do that weird thing of like, we have our production queue and I kind of look at it and I go, I couldn't possibly write with any authority on that one. This one here seems like anybody could do it. And so it can wait an hour until somebody who's younger comes in. Okay, here's the one.
So are you like what Mike Dorn used to do at Newsarama in terms of, are you like running the desk and handing out assignments as well?
No, I'm just the staff. I'm the senior staff writer. And it's funny because like, I think part of the reason that I'm not editorial is simply because I won't move. Like I'm not going to move to Nashville.
Where are they? Where they're in Nashville?
Yeah, they're in Nashville.
And is that for Jim Viscardi? Is Jim still running it?
Yeah, Jim's running our operations, and like Jim and Joe, who's our owner or was our owner because we now are owned by Paramount.
Yes,
but Jim and Joe have been in Nashville since we opened an office, and so anytime you see somebody on the like fancy sets, those are the folks who are the Nashville locals, and then we have our podcast where there's a couple people on the fancy set and everybody gets green screened in.
Are you doing the podcast, or do they go to you?
They've every single time they've been like, oh, you should come guest on the podcast. I was like, yeah, sure. Just let me know a time. And it either hasn't happened or I couldn't do it. So it's one of those, I'm sure that I'll do it. I do some multimedia stuff sometimes in terms of I've done red carpets. I used to cover a lot more red carpets prior to us exploding in size. When there were 7 employees, it was like, okay, yeah, I'll twist my arm. I'll go do the Batman, Superman, red carpet. But the biggest thing that I do in terms of multimedia now is like, I'll come up with ideas and be like, hey, look, the TikTok people can do X because Y is going to be a TV show now. Like and I don't make assignments. I don't have that authority, but I tend to just send things to my boss and be like, hey, Viscardi, have you thought about this thing? Because it would probably get some eyeballs, you know?
Give my best to Jim. I haven't talked to him in a while.
Yeah.
But I've always appreciated, when he was at Marvel, but also what he's done with comicbook.com. I think it's a great site.
Thank you. It's funny because like his podcast back before he was with us was one of those, it was very much like Word Balloon. It was long form. It was sitting down with one creator and kind of doing bullet points of their career, basically. Yeah. And it's like, I enjoyed it so much. I keep trying to get him to let me revive it as a Paramount branded thing. Like, if you don't have time for this, I'll just do that and call it comicbook.coms. So
and it's a great idea, man. And again, I think you certainly have the skill to do it and the experience and, can easily, assemble the right people to be interviewed.
Yeah,
and then also having the Paramount push has got to help. Sure. Let me ask you, and again, I'm not looking for spoilers,
right?
But given that you're covering Superman and Lois, have they sent you advanced screeners? Have you seen any episodes? And if you have, just again, without spoiling, how's the tone of season 3?
I have the first 2 sitting in my email. I haven't had a chance to watch them yet, but
okay.
I'm gonna be doing it this weekend because I'm talking to the showrunners on Monday.
Great.
So ask me again in 24 hours.
All right. Damn it. All right. That's okay. No, obviously we're all curious to see the new actor that's playing Jonathan and everything, and see how that works out. But I mean, my God, Tyler Hoechlin, and shame on me, I never remember Lois's name.
Bitsy Tulloch.
Man, they are great.
Yeah.
They're so great. And I'm a big Tom Welling, Erica Durant's fan as far as Clark and Lois, in the Smallville days. And also back to Legends and really the Arrowverse in general. Time for a victory lap. 10 years is plenty. And also the nature that the CW is changing.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm surprised that they are still going to have a couple Arrowverse adjacent shows moving forward. And I don't know how long that's going to last.
It's funny because the idea of the network changing is something that comes up a lot in the book, because when I was talking to, obviously one of the big things, if I ever talk to fans and I say, hey, I'm going to talk to Keto, what do you want to know? There's at least one angry person who says, why the hell did she end it on a cliffhanger? And, there's a couple of answers for that. But one of the big things is there was never hey, it's ending. What happened was that they got reached out to after the script had already been written. And it was like, hey, remember, you haven't been renewed. Maybe you should soften this. And then it's like, but the script's done. What are we going to, we don't have much choice without just butchering the ending. But even beyond that, it's like, yeah, you're not renewed yet, which means theoretically you should be careful. But if you look at the show, year over year, the ratings got better 2 years in a row. And by the time the show ended, it was in the top 40% of shows on the network. So when people would come to me as a reporter and as a expert and say, hey, do you think the show is going to be canceled? I would say, no way. It's in the top 40% of the network. It increased year over year. The only way that makes sense is if you cancel 60% of all the shows on the network. And then little do I know that both Warner Brothers and the CW are just falling apart beneath their feet a year ago. And suddenly it's like, oh, we're going to cancel the top 70% of the shows.
Unbelievable. Yeah, man. Are reruns of Legends streaming anywhere?
I believe, the whole show is available on Netflix, and I believe it's free on the CW website, although I could be wrong. It might be one of those things where after 90 days they don't. Funny enough, in spite of Legends ending, this holiday season they reran Bebo Saves Christmas. I don't know if you know what that is. They made an animated special based on an in-universe toy.
Yes.
And I asked Phil, the co-creator, about that. I was like, yeah. So Bebo Saves Christmas, it's not on the Blu-ray, it's not on the complete box set, and it is on TV still, even though the show's over. What's going on there? And it was because the guy who used to run the CW, Mark Pedowitz, he loved Legends. He loved Bebo. So the CW made that thing. Warner Brothers didn't put any money into it. And so apparently the CW just owns Bebo, or not Bebo as a character, but Bebo Saves Christmas, just owns that outright. And so it'll probably never get a disc release or anything like that. It's like, you know, if you go buy that on Vudu now, because once they get bored of it, it might disappear forever.
Oh, that's good that at least it's on Vudu. That's good.
Yeah, it wasn't until it reran this year. It's funny because last year they ran it and it was only available on the CW website. This year they reran it, and I think so many people were like, hey, is this anywhere? And the answer was no, because it was like the day after they reran it, suddenly it was available to buy digitally on like Vudu and Amazon and stuff. And I did, by the way, I did speak with Ben Diskin, who was the voice of Bebo for the book. One of the things that I'm enjoying is like, there's a handful of things. First of all, I'm looking back through old archives and being like, anything that never got, because without getting too deep into the weeds, I'm exclusive to Comic Book, but this is not in any way affiliated with them. And so I had to spend a few months going back and forth with HR and legal at Paramount to make sure that they didn't believe this to be a conflict of interest in any way. And one of the things that I cannot do, if I refer to old interviews, for instance, like if I say, you know, in 2013, Brandon Routh said X, it can't be something he told me on a red carpet for Comic Book. They own that. Like Paramount owns that. Even if I did the interview, if it ran on their website, it is not in this book.
Okay.
There are some exceptions, like the set visits we did were roundtables, and another reporter said, "Oh yeah, just you can use my archives, like license it for $1 kind of thing."
Sure.
Yeah. But like I'm looking back through some of my old archives and being like, if there's anything that did not run on Comic Book and that they did not pay to have transcribed. So it was just like a thing that fell through the cracks, which almost never happens, but it does happen. That stuff will end up in the book because it's like, well, now it gets some kind of use, and it was like that person didn't waste their time talking to me. And one of those was Ben Diskin from Bebo Saves Christmas, because I at the time I talked to him, and I talked to the writer, and I talked to the director, and it just became like, okay, I have one day before the show airs. I guess the star is the least urgent to get up, and then it just never happened.
That's hilarious. Now, you see, that reminds me, and forgive me, Marvel, but it did crack me. And these are people that weren't at Marvel. And by the way, they understood, or they're not at Marvel anymore.
Yeah.
But Marvel would have, and Russ, I don't know if you were ever on those conference call press conferences where they announced the new book. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know about you, but when I was, first of all, I think I was the only podcast that they would invite for a while, which was incredibly kind. And it meant a lot. But then initially they're like, okay, you can only use your questions and their answers to your questions on Word Balloon. And I'm like, wait a minute. And I come from sports where coach roundtable press conferences are an after and pregame ritual. Everybody's there. Everybody has the same access to the entire press conference and stuff. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. I go, I use the sports analogy, and literally they're like, all right, hang on a second. And then they went and conferred. They're like, you're right. We're sorry. Of course you could use the whole half hour or whatever. And I'm like, okay, great. Because really, I'm like, well, guys, come on, man.
Yeah.
This isn't the cure for cancer. I don't believe, and maybe I was wrong, Russ. I assumed that everybody was using everyone else's questions when they would write their articles.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think, certainly as a matter of policy, they never told print writers, hey, you can't use anybody else's quote. Otherwise, what would have been the point of having it be a press conference? Instead, you could have just had each person get 2 questions.
One-on-one, or whatever, one-on-ones,
Yeah, but that's what I was thinking when you were describing that. I was like, wait a second, but you're getting one question then, and every print journalist is getting all of their questions, plus they can also use yours probably before you get your editing done.
Yeah, a lot of them were doing almost like live chats where, I remember Newsarama doing that, in fact, that,
that's
they
right,
were.
Because we had that new stuff that they rolled out for New York Comic Con that was like the live update thing that I hated.
Oh, God. That's so funny, Russ. Jesus.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about that live update stuff, though. The first time I ever had to use that software at Newsarama was for a Grant Morrison Spotlight panel at New York Comic Con. And not right after, obviously, but the next day, after having had time to see it and read it and whatever, Brian Cunningham came up to me and he goes, "Hey, I saw your Grant Morrison thing. It's really good. You did a really great job of like getting the important stuff and prioritizing and blah, 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 blah." He's like, "Would you be interested in doing some freelance work for Wizard?" And this was, 10 years or whatever after I had been an intern at Wizard and then done a little freelance work when I was a kid. And at the time, I think I was at Newsarama. I wasn't exclusive or anything. So I was like, yeah, absolutely. Here's my number. Never heard back from him. And for a while, I figured like, oh, he's just blowing smoke. He's being nice. And then I found out, no, that was the weekend that he went home and they fired like everybody at Wizard. And Brian was at DC the next time I saw him.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
It was just like, oh, so that's what happened there.
Jesus. It's well, as I keep saying to creators and just even fans and stuff, the world of genre fiction is like an earthquake, rumbling under our feet.
Oh yeah.
And what flies today may not fly next week. You never know.
Oh, it's crazy looking back at what we did at Comic Book 3 years ago or 5 years ago, because it's like I've been at the same site for almost 12 years now. And when I came on board, it was like a clearinghouse for other people's links that got about 13,000 monthly unique views. Obviously, we're significantly more than that now. And so I have this really interesting continuity where I can look back through my clips and be like, oh, Jesus, this is the kind of thing we used to write. and sometimes I say that nostalgically because it's like I used to get to do a lot more interesting stuff about indie comics because it's like that's the only people who talk to me. And sometimes I say it with the like, oh my God, that's right. 5 years ago, we had that real hard turn into clickbait for about a year. And so like the world is constantly changing around us in this space. And it's bizarre because you can be doing the same job at the same company for 10 years, and it's basically 6 different jobs.
Understood. Absolutely. Is Paramount letting comicbook.com editorially mostly, doing its own thing? Certainly they've got, I mean, my God, big news yesterday with Discovery making the announcement that, they're going to wrap up, obviously. And currently the success of season 3 of Picard.
Yeah, they've been really good. I have not seen on my end as a reporter any significant change in the way that we cover anything since we got bought by Paramount. Now, I will say the first person who ran Comic Book, like Viscardi's boss, not Jim.
Okay.
Like the first person who like ran us for CBS had already previously been our CEO before he got hired away by CBS. And then he basically convinced them to buy us.
Okay.
And so when we came on board, you had this guy who had a really good sense of what our brand identity was, what made us work, what made us special. And so I think he was able to kind of tell his bosses, like, look, we're going to spend money on this and then screw it up if you mess with things. Let me do my job. And he's no longer with the company, but it seems to me that Jim Viscardi, who also has been with us a long time and knows what he's doing, has stepped up into that role. And so I think we've been very lucky. I think a lot of companies, when they get swallowed up by a conglomerate, it's easy for Paramount management to be like, well, Paramount's much bigger than comicbook.com, so we know what we're talking about. And I think that we've just been incredibly lucky that in the time since we were purchased, we've had people there in management who are always there to say, yeah, no, they've been on a growth path for 10 consecutive years. Do you want to be the manager that screws that up?
I hear you, man. I sadly remember, and I will name names in this case, when Space.com bought Newsarama.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Russ. Oh, yeah. And, man, I'll tell you, that first New York 2008, where we had the skybox and everything, and I was running around the pits, the main floor, grabbing people with the camera guy and stuff and shooting things. And God bless Matt Brady, because they had a double booking situation where I want to say Orson Scott Card was talking to my friends at the Stack, and I love those guys, Comic Book Club. Those are great guys. I like them a lot. They were doing that interview, and somebody needed to run up and talk to Grant Morrison. And Matt's like, "We'll get Suntress up here. He'll talk to him and everything." Nice. We had 10 nice minutes, and it was great. I felt like a relief pitcher coming in and striking out my half of the inning. Yeah. And literally, Matt is in their faces, the Space.com guys. Is like, this is why we need Suntress. You can call him in a second's notice, and he knows how to do a great interview. And they're like, oh, yeah, okay, great. And it's like, those guys, I hated those Space.com guys. Oh, I never got along with them, and I thought they were full of shit. I'm saying this, everybody, not Russ.
I'll agree with you too, because I will say, like, the whole time I was there, which I contributed to the blog, which was largely unpaid, and then I also did freelance work.
Sure.
And in the entire time that I was at Newsarama, which was like 2 to 3 years, I think overall, never ever had a problem getting paid. Never. Until October 2008. and you're talking about New York, and it's like I did a bunch of work at New York that year, and I remember having to like personally walk down and knock on Duran's door and be like, can somebody cut me a check, please? It's been 3 months of getting emails back and forth. It was immediately, you're like, this is obviously the new ownership, because nothing even remotely like this has ever happened before, you know?
Yep. No, I hear you, man. And I love Mike too. Mike was always good to me as well. But yeah, man, it wasn't their company anymore. It wasn't Mad Mike's company anymore. And it was very obvious. That's when I left. So yeah, I mean, believe me, I hear you.
It's funny. I left shortly after that. I happened to be living in New York at the time. And I like, every time I tell that story, I'm like, that only works because I was living in New York. Like, that only works because I could literally walk down there and do the thing. Like, what about our freelancers who didn't live in the city and couldn't like go and say, I'm not leaving the elevator?
That's great, Russ. See, this is why I'm glad we're talking, man. These kind of war stories. You know, they don't know. The kids, they don't know. Well, listen, man. So far, congrats, but you still have another 28 days.
Yeah, thanks so much.
The campaign, and it's everybody from Russ Burlingame, a totally unofficial oral history of Legends of Tomorrow. You can trust Russ. Honestly, I know, and you likely know as well, because we all read the 24-hour news blogs and stuff, and are well aware of Russ's work at Newsarama, at Wizard, at comicbook.com, and everywhere else he's worked in the past and currently works at. So this is great. I'm so glad you're doing this. The Josie book sounds very intriguing. Everyone should pick that up as well.
Yeah, I'll make sure to send you a PDF of that in the Gold Exchange. I think, honestly, I think you'd love the Gold Exchange, because it's literally.
I was going to say, please send me the Gold Exchange. Yeah. I would love to read that. That's fantastic, man. And I know, listen, I don't want to keep.
I'll send you the super secret version. I have a PDF that includes all the stuff Paramount owns that I couldn't print.
That would be great.
And that's just for me and Dan Jurgens, but I'll send you one.
Russ, that would mean a lot. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to hold you to that. That's fantastic. So everybody, support Russ's Kickstarter campaign for this great oral history, unofficially, of Legends of Tomorrow. I think it's a fantastic subject, and I can't wait to read it after Groundhog Day next year. So that's great. But everybody, thank you, Russ, for coming on today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Like I told you off mic, I've always loved Word Balloon, and when I told my friend Eric Ratcliffe that I was going to be on here, he was just like, "You jerk."
Well, hey man, when you have anything new you want to promote, Russ, you're always welcome back.
Absolutely. I'll reach out in a year and a half when I'm writing about like Velocipaster 2 or something.
I'm for it. That's fantastic. Everybody have a great weekend. More Word Balloon Live coming next week and throughout March, and obviously throughout the year. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Until next time, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.